recent times we had been communicating frequently via email and bashing each other. Rod Stewart has experienced controversy before. His distinctively raspy voice, theatrical flair, and more than 60 years of profession have made him one of rock's most identifiable icons. Notwithstanding the glamour, #1 records and packed arenas, Rod has established a reputation for being surprisingly honest. The iconic singer is making news once more at the age of 80. For exposing the 7 musicians he claims he detested the most during his career, not for a new album or a final tour. Rod doesn't mince words like hate. Furthermore, his unabashed honesty is uncommon and remarkable in the music industry, where behind-the-scenes battles are frequently hidden beneath smiles and press releases. These are not little quarrels or casual dislikes. For all the wrong reasons, Rod says, these musicians made a lasting impression. What was the source of these conflicts? Was it rivalry, ego, betrayal, or just conflicting personalities in the spotlight of celebrity? Some names will raise eyebrows while others may not be shocking. Your opinion of the individuals on the list may radically shift. Hits, scandals, and reinvention of Rod Stewart. Rod Stewart's distinctively raspy voice, spiky blonde hair, and larger-than-life manner have made his name an indelible part of modern music history. For more than 60 years he has been delighting audiences. Beyond the sold-out tours, #1 singles, and knighthood, however, Rod's path has been filled with twists and turns, triumphs, rebirths, and even controversies. Stewart's journey from his early years in London to his rise to fame as a worldwide music star is both motivational and occasionally thought-provoking. On January 10, 1945, Rod Stewart was born Roderick David Stewart in London, England. His early years in post-war Britain were characterized by his love of music and sport. His zeal quickly brought him to the center of the British rock movement in the 1960s. He began his career as a performer with a number of bands, including Faces and the Jeff Beck Group. During this time, Rod's raw singing style and magnetic energy caught the attention of both industry insiders and fans. His performances were exciting, rough, and unvarnished, a style that would quickly come to define him. Rod Stewart made his solo debut in 1969 with the release of his first album, An Old Raincoat Won't Ever Let You Down, which is referred to as the Rod Stewart album in the United States. Although he didn't become instantly famous, the release was the start of his distinctive brand, poignant lyrics, soulful delivery, and a folk rock and blues fusion that distinguished him from other singers of his day. However, his real innovation was only around the bend. With the publication of Every Picture Tells a Story in 1971, Rod had solidified his place in the global music scene. In addition to topping the US and UK charts, the album gave the world its first taste of Maggie May, a song that would come to define his career. This song demonstrated the special fusion of swagger and vulnerability that made Rod so alluring, with its catchy tune and candid lyrics. He quickly rose to prominence as one of rock's most identifiable vocalists. Stewart's ascent to prominence persisted into the middle of the 1970s thanks to successes like Tonight's the Night, Sailing, and You Wear It Well. His accomplishment was no accident, he demonstrated. Fans of all ages responded favorably to his music because it was both approachable and intensely personal. Rod's career underwent a strategic and symbolic change in 1975 when he relocated to the US. This maneuver resulted in a discernible change in sound. His music started to focus more on pop and popular culture, which attracted new listeners while also alienating some devoted fans. Rod completely adopted the pop-rock style of the time between 1978 and 1983. The radio and charts were dominated by songs like Young Turks and Do You Think I'm Sexy? These upbeat, well-produced songs contributed to his status as a worldwide superstar. As he sold out venues all over the world, Rod reacted to critics who occasionally questioned the commercial orientation of his music with success after success. His induction as a solo artist into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1994 formally solidified his place in music history. This honor acknowledged his impact on future generations of artists and performers, in addition to his chart accomplishments. Stewart shocked fans once more by reinventing his sound as the 2000s drew near. He put out a number of recordings under the Great American Songbook collection between 2002 and 2010. Rod abandoned his rock background and adopted jazz standards and timeless American songs. tunes popularized by artists like as Nat King Cole and Frank Sinatra. This surprising pivot demonstrated Rod's versatility and struck a chord with an entirely new audience. He had once again reinvented himself and remained relevant in a changing industry, so he was far from being a relic of the past. Rod released his autobiography, Rod, the Autobiography, in 2012. From his working-class background to the excesses of celebrity, his sexual relationships and his setbacks and victories along the road, the book provided a close-up look into his personal and professional life. It gave fans a long-awaited unvarnished glimpse of the artist behind the songs. Then at Buckingham Palace in 2016, Prince William meted him, marking yet another career turning point. In recognition of his charitable and musical contributions, Rod Stewart was formally made Sir Rod Stewart. Few artists ever get that kind of recognition, capping off decades of influence around the world. Rod never slowed down, not even in his senior years. He put out several albums between 2018 and 2023, such as Blood Red Roses and The Tears of Hercules. International tours accompanied every new endeavor, demonstrating that he could still lead a stage with charisma and vitality at the age of 70 and beyond. Due to his ageless performance quality and sense of nostalgia, concert venues were packed with audiences of all ages. However, Rod has experienced controversy throughout his life and work. The lyrics of several of Stewart's early songs have been criticized for decades. Songs like Hot Legs and Tonight's the Night have been criticized for being out of date or sexist, particularly when analyzed from a contemporary perspective. Though these songs were quite popular when they were first released, they have since been re-examined by critics who have identified themes that many people today find objectionable. The criticisms have followed Rod throughout his career, despite his occasional defenses that his songwriting was a product of its time. The media has also been quite interested in his personal life. Tabloids have frequently exploited Rod Stewart's 8 offspring from 5 different women as evidence of his rock star excess. Even though Rod has always been candid about his affection for his kids and his attempts to be a present father, his musical achievements have frequently been eclipsed by the tales of his amorous past. Rod's public image has also been hampered by legal issues. He has been sued multiple times over the years for no-shows and canceled concerts. The most prominent of these occurred in the early 2000s, when he was forced to pay more than $2 million after canceling a show in Las Vegas because of illness. Rod's otherwise illustrious career was marred by the court's decision to rule against him, despite his justifiable health concerns. Artists' feuds have also garnered media attention. In particular, his feud with Elton John has been extensively reported. Even though the two have a lengthy history of being friends and detractors of one another, their public interactions have occasionally become tense. Their relationship has fluctuated between light-hearted banter and real strain, as evidenced by their mockery of each other's tour choices and their exchange of insults during interviews. Nevertheless, they have been able to get back together multiple times over the years. Rod made headlines once more in 2020, but not for his music. He and his son Sean got into a physical altercation with a security guard at a hotel in Florida on New Year's Eve 2019. Rod is accused of punching someone in a video. Simple batteries were used to charge both. Although the case was ultimately settled in 2021 with a plea agreement that spared Rod from jail time, the incident added another chapter to his long record of public scandals. His lip-syncing during certain live performances has also drawn criticism. Fans and critics have occasionally questioned the authenticity of some of his acts, even though this approach is customary with aging performers or in televised settings. His ability to engage audiences, whether live or not, is still praised by many. The reason he detested Elton John. The legacy of Rod Stewart is as complex as it is renowned. In addition to being a family guy, he is a controversial public personality, a boundary-pushing performer, and a chart-topping artist. He has been able to stay relevant across generations by being resilient and reinventing himself. Not many artists can say that. Rod Stewart has obviously always lived and played completely on his own terms, even though his path hasn't been without setbacks. He has carried that unvarnished honesty into his 80s. And now, in a moment that has made headlines and generated a lot of discussion, Rod Stewart has revealed the 7 musicians he claims to have detested the most over his lengthy career. Despite being extremely personal and undoubtedly controversial, the list provides a unique glimpse into the complex realm of artistic competition and showbiz egos. It's interesting to note that Rod didn't mince words. He saw it as a snapshot in time, a representation of real annoyance, opposing personalities, and occasionally even hurt pride. And Elton John is the most notable, and possibly the most talked about of those names. One of the most famous love-hate tales in music history is the complex connection between Rod Stewart and Elton John. Both of them made their breakthroughs in the late 1960s and early 1970s, riding comparable waves of popularity and even attracting audiences that overlapped. However, the two frequently found themselves at conflict, sometimes in private and other times in public, despite their shared roots in British rock and their shared international renown. Rod Stewart has referred to Elton as a frenemy, which sums up their changing relationship rather well. In interviews they occasionally offered encouragement, complimented one another, or even made loving jokes, but there were also instances when the gloves fell off and what had been light-hearted banter evolved into actual animosity. Among them were when Elton announced his final Yellow Brick Road tour in 2018, it caused well-documented rifts between the two, a lavish multi-year farewell tour that was billed as his last tour. Rod didn't mince words. He publicly chastised Elton in an interview for what he perceived to be a money-grabbing tactic. He made fun of the notion of a lengthy farewell, implying that such abrupt departures were driven more by marketing than by true emotion. He remarked, "It stinks of selling tickets." Naturally, Elton took the statement seriously. "It's dishonest. It's not rock and roll." In his memoir, he expressed his hurt at Rod's remarks, describing them as cruel and hypocritical, particularly from someone he had thought of as a friend. Their relationship appeared to take a drastic turn at that point, transforming a long-standing conflict into a highly visible split. In interviews, Rod also mentioned how he thought Elton occasionally came across as patronizing or contemptuous. Their friendship, in his opinion, was never totally equal, that even when they got along, there was always a competitive element to their interactions. "I think he's brilliant, but sometimes he just doesn't know when to stop talking," Rod once said. Such remarks, made with a smile but with a distinct bite, were a defining characteristic of their public persona. Why Rod Stewart detested David Bowie and Freddie Mercury. Their interaction with Elton John demonstrated the depth and intensity of Rod Stewart's relationships in the music business. He had other names on his list though. Rod Stewart acknowledged that he detested the 7 artists the most. Freddie Mercury and David Bowie were 2 more names that stood out due to their musical genius, iconic prominence, and complex connections to Stewart himself. Because these 2 legends, like Rod, influenced the sound and fashion of a time, their inclusion sparked even more controversy. However, Stewart asserts that respect for someone's ability does not always translate into harmony within one's own life. Many people consider Queen's frontman Freddie Mercury to be one of the most charismatic musicians in rock history. He stands out from almost everyone else in the industry, thanks to his theatrical stage presence, vocal range, and brazen uniqueness. However, Rod Stewart believes that the same characteristics that made Freddie Mercury a legend also caused a decades-long conflict between them. The 2 audiences occasionally overlapped, had mutual friends, and shared stages. However, behind the scenes, their relationship was rarely cordial, frequently combative, and occasionally competitive. According to reports, Rod thought Freddie's off-stage persona and performances were too dramatic and extravagant. It wasn't that Rod didn't like Freddie's showmanship or voice. He actually recognized Mercury's potential multiple times, but he found Freddie's incessant urge to dominate the spotlight to be draining. Freddie's theatrical flair seemed over the top to Rod, who based his success on rock and roll attitude and raspy honesty. Freddie always needed to be the center of attention, he once said. Many would contend that the criticism was more motivated by personal annoyance than by professional criticism. The reciprocal recognition of each other's dominance was what added interest to this dynamic. In a field full of large personalities,
Rod and Freddie were both alpha characters. Both of them had a strong desire to perform, were British, and were flamboyant, in their own unique ways. However, they had rather different ideas about what it meant to be a star. Freddie welcomed the operatic, huge vocals, dramatic costumes, and arena-scale spectacle, while Rod favored honest narrative and raw, gritty performance techniques. Both were unable to completely ignore the rivalry that sprang from that disparity. Occasionally, efforts were made to work together or compromise. According to rumors, Rod, Freddie and Elton John briefly explored starting a supergroup in the early 1980s. The group was playfully named Nose, Teeth, and Hair, a self-deprecating reference to their physical peculiarities. However, the concept never gained traction. In actuality, the emotional distance between them still exists, in spite of the jokes and interviews. According to reports, Rod also had a hard time relating to Freddie's way of life and sense of humor. He believed that Mercury was surrounded by people who supported his exaggerated persona, which made it difficult to have sincere discussions and show respect for one another. Up to Freddie's tragic death in 1991, there was a persistent feeling of separation between the two due to their disparate artistic styles and personal disconnects. Later in life, Rod said he respected Mercury's legacy. However, that didn't eliminate the long-standing personal rift that had previously caused him to identify Freddie as one of the persons he had the greatest trouble with. Rod Stewart also didn't think twice about mentioning David Bowie. Bowie, the rock chameleon, who never stopped changing, was renowned for pushing limits and reinventing himself in ways that frequently made it difficult for the rest of the business to keep up. Rod, however, didn't always find Bowie's changes to be genuine. He once said that he didn't like Bowie's deliberate stylization, since he tried too hard to be unique. Rod saw a distinction between deliberate performance and artistic renewal, and he sensed that Bowie frequently crossed it. When both were making waves in the UK and competing for comparable headlines in the early 1970s, Rod and Bowie were at odds. While Rod was making waves with his own fusion of rock, soul and folk, Bowie's Ziggy Stardust character was the talk of the town. Despite being implicit, the competition was extremely genuine. Each embodied a distinct vision of music's future. Rod's rootsy rebellious appeal, and Bowie's futuristic otherworldly flair. Bowie's pretentiousness was something Rod frequently criticized. Bowie's frequent reincarnations, from Ziggy Stardust to the Thin White Duke and beyond, seemed to him to be more about appearance than content. Rod occasionally made disparaging remarks in interviews, claiming that Bowie's approach came across as overly dramatic. Bowie took offense at the comment, and responded by disparaging Rod's music, once referring to it as the worst form of pub rock. Why Rod Stewart criticized John Lennon and Ed Sheeran. Rod Stewart's candor in naming musicians he had disagreements with, like Freddie Mercury and David Bowie, presents a picture of a man who isn't ashamed to admit the conflicts that come with living in the spotlight. However, the list went on from there. Two other names that were as audacious and dominant as any in music history surfaced as Rod continued to consider the individuals in the industry who had most pushed or irritated him: John Lennon and Ed Sheeran. Each embodied a distinct energy and brand of celebrity, and each, in Rod's opinion, exhibited characteristics that both personally and artistically offended him. One of the best-selling musicians of the modern period, Ed Sheeran, gained a worldwide fanbase by virtue of his sincere lyrics, genuine acoustics, and grounded public demeanor. Rod Stewart, meanwhile, was not impressed by Sheeran's quick ascent and ubiquitous pop presence. It caused suspicion. According to reports, Rod has expressed worries that Sheeran's songwriting relies too much on formula, even though it is approachable and emotionally compelling. He questioned whether the young artist's enormous success was the result of their ability to write songs that fit commercial categories, or their artistic inventiveness. Instead than being personal in a nasty way, Rod's problem with Sheeran was a creative and generational gap. For Rod, who worked tirelessly in clubs for decades, building a reputation through unpolished performances and creative daring, Sheeran's meticulously orchestrated ascent, complete with viral promotion and major label accuracy, felt produced. In one instance, Rod implied that Sharon's work was safe because it lacked the edge or unpredictable quality that he believed characterized great rock and roll craftsmanship. The industry's overwhelming acceptance of Sharon, who appeared to control award events, streaming services, and charts all at once, may have exacerbated this divide. Rod might have seen Sharon's pervasiveness as representative of a music industry that now prioritizes algorithm-driven popularity over live grit and artistic development, given his own success was difficult and required years of reinvention. Then there was John Lennon, a titan of music in the 20th century. Lennon, one of the original Beatles members, contributed to changing the fundamentals of contemporary music. Rod Stewart did not always have a positive opinion of Lennon, despite his revolutionary influence. Although Rod never disputed Lennon's talent as a songwriter or his cultural heritage, he discovered that their ideologies and temperaments were at odds. In both public and private discourse, Rod allegedly described Lennon as needlessly confrontational. Lennon frequently used his platform for provocation, activism, and incisive social commentary, in contrast to Rod's preference for charm and humor. Lennon's propensity to preach or moralize through music and media appearances infuriated Rod, even though he was by no means a political figure. According to some reports, Rod found Lennon's energy confrontational and excessively intense, yet their paths occasionally crossed at industrial functions. Furthermore, Rod disapproved of Lennon's post-Beatles trajectory, especially the unvarnished simplicity of his solo music and public appearances, alongside Yoko Ono. Polish performance and audience interaction were important to Rod. Although Lennon appeared to favor remarks that pushed boundaries and exposed vulnerability, Rod didn't necessarily perceive that as artistic. At times, it simply seemed self-indulgent. The reasons behind Rod Stewart's animosity towards Paul McCartney and George Harrison. Rod Stewart's candor in identifying John Lennon and Ed Sheeran as musicians with whom he had previously had disagreements wasn't intended to incite trouble. It involved establishing distinct boundaries between the kind of musicians and mentalities he identified with and those he did not. However, the list didn't stop there. Two more iconic names entered the discussion as he began to consider the friendships, rivalries, adoration, and resentments that had occurred throughout the decades in the music industry. Paul McCartney with George Harrison. Many were taken aback by their selection, not because of their evident renown, but rather because they both stand as pillars of the very rock environment that Rod Stewart helped create. However, Rod felt that their individuality and artistic trajectories caused more conflict than affection. The Fab Four's spiritual core was George Harrison, who was frequently referred to as the Quiet Beatle. Harrison's solo career after the Beatles demonstrated that he had a unique voice and identity beyond Lennon and McCartney. He was well known for his reflective songwriting and growing interest in Eastern philosophy. However, Rod Stewart found it difficult to ignore the emotional barrier established by Harrison's apparent aloofness and intellectual tendencies. According to reports, Rod thought Harrison was aloof, restrained, and a little patronizing, and he appreciated warmth, humor, and accessibility in his musical colleagues. Although the two never had a well-publicized falling out, Rod is reported to have thought Harrison took life and music too seriously. At one point, Rod implied that George had forgotten that music was meant to be enjoyable. That remark reveals a great deal about their divergent perspectives. Rod viewed rock and roll as a show, a celebration, and a source of energy. Harrison frequently used songwriting as a means of introspection and societal or spiritual criticism, particularly in his later years. That direction seemed too harsh to Rod. Additionally, Rod was perplexed by what he characterized as George's subtle aggressiveness during public appearances and interviews. Rod felt it annoying that Harrison had a knack of making subtle, courteous jabs that were a form of veiled criticism. In contrast to Paul McCartney's charisma in public or John Lennon's combative style, George could express disapproval in a quiet way without ever speaking. That kind of subtle tension made it difficult to establish a genuine connection for someone like Rod Stewart, who appreciated openness and honesty. Paul followed. Possibly the most unexpected addition of all, Paul McCartney's contributions to music are legendary, and he is widely regarded as one of the most popular and successful musicians in contemporary history. Paul has remained relevant, creative, and popular for more than 50 years, from his time with the Beatles to his solo work in Wings. However, McCartney's charisma and consistency were insufficient to overcome Rod Stewart's perception of a profound artistic mismatch. According to people close to both artists, their hostility wasn't caused by a single explosive incident. The estrangement was more gradual and resulted from years of seeing one another from different parts of the industry. According to reports, Rod thought McCartney was too calculating, meticulously manicured his image, and shunned genuine vulnerability in both his music and public life. Rod, who always took great satisfaction in being himself on stage and in interviews, found Paul's polished demeanor to be unsettling. Rod specifically criticized what he saw as McCartney's inclination to take it easy, both personally and musically. Rod is reported to have chastised Paul for rarely taking genuine creative chances after the Beatles, despite the fact that Paul has produced several well-known singles. He believed McCartney was more concerned with preserving his reputation than breaking new ground. Rod disliked that kind of strategic thinking, since he preferred impromptu artistic decisions, even if they weren't entirely successful monetarily. According to reports, there was a competitive undertone in their few in-person interactions. Rod once implied that Paul had a slight sense of superiority, which caused a stir among business insiders and fans alike. Rod always appeared to perceive an unstated rivalry between them, whether it was about public favor, stage appearance, or even songwriting prowess. One that persisted in their sporadic encounters, but which Paul never publicly recognized. The reason Rod Stewart and Sting didn't get along. Rod Stewart's unreserved candor concerning George Harrison and Paul McCartney was never intended to undermine traditions. It was about remaining loyal to his understanding of the significance of music. Rod stayed direct, even if it upset people in the top echelons of rock royalty, whereas others could skirt delicate subjects. Fans were therefore taken aback once more when the name Sting was mentioned because, like Rod, Sting is a British legend and a well-known singer-songwriter who has received widespread praise. However, Rod Stewart did not see Sting as a musical kin. He was a person whose demeanor, mannerisms, and artistic abilities annoyed him in a number of ways. According to several people close to both men, Rod's unease with Sting has been there for decades, and is more the result of personality conflicts than of a single explosive occurrence. Even while they frequently met paths, whether on music awards shows, charity events, or in joint interviews, their relationship never really clicked. Known for his easygoing charm and self-deprecating humor, Rod Stewart thought Sting's manner was too serious, and in his opinion, self-important. Sting frequently came across as introspective, and in Rod's opinion, overly self-satisfied, whereas Rod preferred to laugh at himself. Sting takes himself more seriously than the Queen's address, according to a joke Rod made once. Despite being humorous, the jab conveyed real annoyance. According to Rod, Sting consistently exuded an air of superiority throughout interviews and backstage interactions. For Rod, Sting's reputation for intellectualism, of which he frequently cited poets, philosophies, and world music influences, felt like an exercise in self-promotion, regardless of the profundity of his lyrics, the social problems he supported, or the complex musicianship of his performances. Congratulation instead of genuineness. Their musical styles also contrasted greatly. As the lead singer of the Police and as a solo performer, Sting established a distinctive style by fusing elements of rock, jazz, reggae, and classical music. His lyrics, which were frequently full of metaphor and philosophical contemplation, tended towards the intellectual. In contrast, Rod's popularity was based on simple, emotionally honest narrative, and songs that made you want to sing, dance, or cry. Not always decipher poetic meaning levels. For Rod, music was about connecting on an instinctual level rather than overanalyzing. Even while he respected Sting's intricate compositions, he wasn't moved by them. The issue of performance style is another. Rod felt that a live performance should be a party, a spectacle that leaves the audience in awe, and Sting's controlled, restrained, and frequently minimalist stage presence ran against to that. For Rod, Sting's performances were less of an exciting experience, and more of a musical lecture. In a backstage conversation, he once remarked that seeing Sting perform was like sitting through a well-lit university lecture. Perhaps the most persistent issue between them, however, had nothing to do with music. It was related to attitude and personality. Always the showman and self-proclaimed man of the people, Rod took great satisfaction in being personable. He had no intention of separating himself from his audience. Rod believed that Sting fostered the opposite image, a polished, aloof, and possibly even distant demeanor. Rod thought this was pretentious, whether Sting meant it to be that way. Later, Rod half-jokingly told a journalist that Sting would most likely practice his own birthday party. Rod's long-held opinion that Sting lacked the looseness and sense of fun that made music truly alive was reinforced by this light-hearted remark. It was more than simply striking the correct notes in Rod's world. It was about joy, spirit, and making genuine connections with real people.